we had kind of a light this afternoon to begin with, so we'll go with another thrilling edition of Adventures in Radioland. This segment, Hasty Decisions 2, subtitled The German Tank Transmitter. From time to time on our Qso-Vlog network, I discuss the downside of hasty decisions. Now, I don't want to minimize the obvious upside to hasty decisions, but the downside can be far more interesting. Hence, let's move along with the tale of the German tank transmitter. It was a hot afternoon in West Palm Beach, Florida. I was a young man of 20 or so, working in my unair-conditioned shop. The Florida heat was such that sweat was pouring from my body. I took my shirt off to try and cool down as I wrestled with this 30-pound boat anchor thing that was on my workbench. It was an old German tank transmitter. I'd purchased it from an Army-Navy surplus store for $25. And it was obviously came from Rommel and his German Desert Tank Corps, or so I assumed by the amount of dust and sand that it was covered with. At least that's what I imagined it to be, you know. The Germans lost that war in the desert, perhaps just because of this radio. This was a low-band VHF radio with a frequency range of 20 to 50 megahertz. And sometimes propagation distances, better known as skip, can be outstanding at those frequencies. Too much so for Rommel and his boys in the desert, because their tank transmissions were being copied loud and clear on the other side of the world in Washington, D.C., much to Rommel's chagrin. Well, this bad boy was sitting on my countertop now. It had been modified somewhere along the way from 12 or 24 volts of DC to 115 volts AC. I had it plugged in and all the tubes were lit, but, you know, there was no output as I keyed the mic, and all of the info on the radio was written in German, so it was not very helpful. But I could almost swear this was Rommel's personal command tank radio. I could almost see his fingerprints in the dust on this radio. But alas, it would not transmit a word, and I wondered why. I had removed the outside cover plates, exposing many beautiful laced cable runs, all covered with a protective, aged orange heavy-duty wax. Most of the wiring appeared to be color-coded, but it was very hard to follow the wiring in a laced-up bundle. So what to do? I have to open up those laced bundles to get a better look. So I took a pair of small manicure scissors and began cutting the cable lacing. It was tough going. The lacing was very tight, and the wax was doing it all it could to keep the bundle together. Well, I'll just have to try a little harder to get these little scissor blades into the bundle so I can cut the lacing away to be able to trace the wiring out. So here I am, with my thumb and finger through the holes of this small pair of chrome scissors. I had moved over the transmitter to get a better angle, so my sweaty chest was laying on the frame, and suddenly everything went red. My body was vibrating violently. I had cut into the high voltage line. When I came to, I was still standing up, but now turned away from the transmitter. And why was my body still vibrating violently? And something else was wrong. I wasn't breathing. Apparently, it had been a perfect storm, my chest on the radio and my fingers through the scissor holes. Meanwhile, back to the not breathing part. I could think about breathing, but I couldn't do it. My lungs were paralyzed from the shock. I also knew that I had a limited time in that condition before I would pass out, maybe permanently. Then I began pounding myself in the chest with my fist, trying to restore my paralyzed lungs. And then, slowly, ever so slowly, I could take little gulps of air. About an hour later, I could breathe a little, but it hurt. A week later, I had recovered. Now, looking back in retrospect, my hasty decision was to start cutting into that cable bundle without first unplugging the radio and shorting out the high voltage. The good side, I had escaped death, barely. Later, much later, I dug a hole and buried that German transmitter never for it to threaten anyone else's life. This has been another thrilling edition of Adventures in Radioland. Well, one of those occurrences in my life I'd just as soon forget, but if it helps somebody else to not make hasty decisions when they're working on equipment, so be it. That's what I'm looking for, is a little suggestion as to one's safety in working on equipment, and not make hasty decisions when you're doing so. Always double check to be sure your equipment's unplugged, and short out the high voltage at that point to make sure you don't get hit by a capacitor charge in the power supply. Anyway, this is the Friday afternoon Qso-Vlog net. If you have a radio you want to check out, give me a shout.